Hey, this is a follow-up video to my last video on Dan McClellan. It's going to attempt to be brief, and we'll see how that goes. But I did get some good feedback on that video, a few good comments there, and the comment that rose to the top was by a user named VirtualFrog2000, and they made a number of good points, and they were reasonably made, and I'm not surprised it got the most likes. So I'm going to respond to their comment and each of their points. That'll be kind of how I structure this video, and then there'll be a few extra things that I'll tag on at the end. To their first point, they said, it sounds from your discussion around minute 14 plus that you're looking for theology and not critical biblical scholarship. Your examples of where he should bring more depth appear to be ones where you disagree with the mainstream of critical scholarship for theological reasons. At least his words are very much in line with how I understand critical scholarship. At the very minimum, you appear to want him to leave the realm of only historical scholarship and to grant confessional scholarship equal validity. I don't expect him to do so, and I don't think he should. This is great, and I'm glad to get the chance to respond to this. This is actually not the case at all. And the comments that other people made about my comment about theology really raised to the surface some deep structural issues within academia, which has to do with the bifurcation or the separation between theology and biblical studies. If you go into academics right now, you in a lot of schools have to choose a track to either take biblical studies or theological studies, and they're two separate disciplines. And when I explain that to some people outside of the academy, they wonder how you can do one without the other. And it's a good question. And this doesn't actually have to do largely with issues of confessionalism or belief. Rather, it stems from the fact that the Bible is an inherently theological document. So even if we just approach it historically, we have to recognize that the authors themselves are doing theology. They're making theological statements and proclamations. That the Bible is a theological document. And so we need some theological awareness as we come to approach it. The discipline of biblical theology is important to understand, because when I say biblical theology, I don't mean that in contrast to unbiblical theology. Rather, biblical theology is a discipline. It's an academic discipline that seeks to understand the interpretive framework that is being employed by the biblical authors in the ways that they are interacting with their religious tradition, because the biblical authors are doing that. They're not all starting from scratch. They're working within a tradition, much of the time reflecting on previously written scriptures or a previously existing religious tradition that they're in. And so rather than approaching each text as it stands on its own, as if it's in isolation, as if it's in a vacuum, the discipline of biblical theology seeks to understand, to uncover and understand the interpretive framework that is being employed by the biblical authors. So it's a fascinating discipline, fascinating study. It's where I've done a lot of my studies so far. And here's the interesting thing. When Dan writes about 2 Kings 3, he is doing biblical theology by definition, as he is reflecting on the theological perspective of the author of that passage as they relate the sacrifice of the son of the king of Moab and the divine wrath that came upon Israel and so on. Reflecting on that and reflecting on what that says about the beliefs of the author, that is the discipline of biblical theology. But as is the case in much of the time in the academy, people are engaging in biblical theology as they do biblical studies. They haven't always necessarily been trained in that. And so I'm not going to comment more on that in regards to Dan, but my bigger statement in the first video is reflective of my, perhaps I'll just say, opinion, that the people who have been trained in biblical theology as a discrete discipline tend to bring a lot more sympathy with them to the biblical texts, not for confessional reasons, but just respect for these authors and the things that they were saying, and understanding that they are working within a framework, they are working within a tradition, and so there is more of a sympathetic viewpoint, and just trying to take the text on its own terms, but not in isolation. So there's probably some more that could be said there, but that's just explaining a little bit about what I meant by biblical theology, not necessarily confessional theology, but that discipline. So I'll leave it there for now. Maybe there's more to say, but I'll move on. Point number 2, they said Dan's channel is great since he brings in sources in essentially every video, cites them, shows them on screen for us to read them. I have some growing issues with his rhetorical approach and him moving to a progressively more rhetorically aggressive position, which I've communicated to him, but he's not just waving his hands at us and expecting us to all just believe him. So no disagreement there on the rhetoric. I certainly highlighted that before. And I don't disagree on the bringing in sources sometimes. Now, I haven't watched every video that he's made. In my experience with my sample size, there does seem to be some variance with how frequently and how carefully he shows his work. But I would hope that people who were seriously interacting with him would do the work of reading and following those sources for themselves. That's really important. Instead of just saying he cites a source, he must be credible, to actually follow up on that. And we're going to see later on in this video why that is really important. Number 3, they say, I'm very impressed at how, while being an Old Testament specialist, his breadth and depth of knowledge in other areas are huge. It's rare to catch him out where I know about scholarship in other areas or science or history. That's great. And I don't have any reason to disagree with that, as long as people know that him being an Old Testament scholar doesn't mean that we can just take him as an expert in all areas to which he speaks, which is one of the points that I was trying to make in my first video, which I'll say more on here as I get to number 4. He's not making videos to argue for a position from base principles. These aren't video format scholarly publications. I would love to see that, but it's just not what the videos are, nor what they are presented as. So responding to them as not being good enough, as this is an inappropriate criticism. I got quite a number of comments along the lines of, yeah, we know that Dan's not doing scholarship in these videos. He says so, we know that, so what's your point? If you know that and you get that, then great. My video wasn't for you then. My video was for the kinds of people who don't read the fine print and who hear someone introduce themselves as a scholar and think that they must know what they're talking about all the time. And in my life, my friends, the people I know, that's a thing. And that's who I was responding to, or who I was perhaps crafting that video for. You think of a handyman making a video about how to install drywall, and he's going to say, make sure you do this and that with the drywall mud. And, you could go on there and say, well, it says that on the side of the bin of mud. Why are you telling us that? Well, not everyone reads the fine print, and those types of videos are helpful to some people. And if they're not helpful to you because you know that already, then you can move along and watch the next video in your feed. Number 5, if you're engaging with serious scholarship beyond a theological commentary when writing your sermons, you're doing a great job. That's really cool to see and quite rare. I appreciate the comment. I think it is rare in some of the circles I've been in. I don't think it should be. I'm an evangelical. There's quite a bit of fairly serious evangelical scholarship. And yeah, a lot of pastors I know don't avail themselves of it. There's quite a bit of excellent scholarship that is not evangelical. And yeah, a fair bit of pastors I know do not engage with that at all. And I think to their impoverishment. Number 6, I note that you don't bring any scholarship forth in this video, unlike what he does. Not great form for the point that you're discussing when you're saying he's misrepresenting the complexity of a situation to not put forth any citations of your own. So a couple of responses here. First, in the prior video that I made, I wasn't interacting with a specific scholarly topic in which this would have been necessary. I did cite some relevant sources for the topic that I was addressing insofar as I let Dan speak for himself, interjecting a couple of his videos, pointing to that piece about the specific nature of PhD studies and so on. So relevant to the topic of the video, there were sources that were there. The one place where I did make a specific claim that I should have backed up and should have cited was where I had said I could cite sources. And as I'm saying that, I'm thinking you should just do that. And so I acknowledge that and I own that. And that has to do with Dan's position on 2 Kings 3, the king of Moab offering his son to Chemosh, the great wrath that comes upon Israel in 2 Kings 3:27. So I acknowledge that, I own that, and let me follow up on that here. I'm going to put a couple of sources here in the video where you can see and you can follow up on some recent scholarship that acknowledges the very controversial nature of how this passage is understood. Erasmus Gass says, what is meant by great fury and whether this was prompted by Yahweh or Adonai or Kamash remain highly controversial. That's from 2009, Journal of Biblical Literature, links there. Scott Morshauser from 2010 gets into that as well, link there. These are just a couple of scholarly articles that you can access that acknowledge that things are a little complicated here. Now, I went a little bit deeper here, and I went back to Dan's unpublished doctoral thesis. Link here. You can go read it for yourself. And there Dan does dig in a little bit more than I represented in the previous video, and I acknowledge that. And here he says, quote, in light of the consistent use of ketzef in reference to divine fury, the text can only be interpreted to be indicating, rather reticently, that the sacrifice successfully invoked the intervention of the Moabite patron deity Chemosh, which forced the retreat of the Israelite forces. So notice how strong his language there. The text can only be interpreted. Now, there's two footnotes on this sentence. The first surveys the use of the phrase great wrath in the Hebrew Bible and says how most of the time this word refers to divine wrath, and the assumption is that's how it should be taken here in this context. The second footnote comes at the end of the sentence and is there to substantiate his claim that this text can only be interpreted in this way. So let's take a look. There are 10 sources. I have access to 9 out of these 10 resources. The first is from Burke O. Long, 2 Kings 3 and Genres of Prophetic Narrative journal article. What's interesting is this journal article says absolutely nothing relevant about this topic. It says absolutely nothing about Chemosh and the king of Moab in terms of the child sacrifice. The great wrath doesn't address it in a meaningful way. The second is from Baruch Margalit, Why King Mesha of Moab Sacrificed His Oldest Son, journal article. And he says, but in light of the foregoing texts, it cannot really be understood as indignation or anger of the Moabite national god Chemosh. The word denotes the psychological breakdown of trauma that affected the Israelite forces when they beheld the sign of human sacrifice atop the walls of Kir Hareseth. So actually disagrees with Dan's point. Number 3, 2 Kings, a new translation with introduction and commentary. This is from the Anchor Bible. And they go into a decent chunk here. I'm not going to read the whole thing. You can access this book yourself. It's on archive.org if you don't have ethical problems with that. And their take on it is that it's ambiguous. They say it could point to one, it could point to the other. They point to the way that different commentators are divided on it. And they say this: the subject of the wrath was left unnamed. The editor could have ascribed it to the wrath of Chemosh, but as Kaufman pointed out, to do so would have been to admit that a foreign deity was indeed a power source on the level of Adonai, and that Mesha's sacrifice was in this sense efficacious, an incredible admission for any biblical author. Or he could have ascribed the wrath to the God of Israel, but Mesha's sacrifice was obviously not to the God of his enemies. A proper biblical explanation would have been to point out some wrongdoing on the part of Israel, which brought on the divine wrath. See examples in the note to verse 27, but such an act was not part of the prophetic tradition in verses 6 to 25. The equivocal wrath might have satisfied the ancient editor, but it has been an embarrassment to all his readers. Notice equivocal. So they are not saying that it is certain. They're not saying the same thing that Dan is saying. His fourth source in the footnote comes from John Barclay Burns, journal article on why did the besieging army withdraw. This, I don't have a public access link to share. I got this through my school. This author does argue for Chemosh's wrath as the most likely read. Fifth source, John D. Levinson, The Death and Resurrection of the Beloved Son, The Transformation of Child Sacrifice in Judaism and Christianity. This is a book. In these pages that address this, he acknowledges other viewpoints and says, more likely, therefore, it is the supposition that the author saw Mesha's sacrifice of his firstborn son as having a profound effect upon the deity to whom it was offered. In this case, presumably the Moabite national deity Chemosh, whose name is nonetheless conspicuously absent from the text. So not as certain and not as clear as it would appear from Dan's comments. The sixth source comes from Hans-Peter Müller. This is from the Dictionary of Demons and Deities, and he does say that this is probably Chemosh. He essentially has one sentence. Of particular instance is the remark in 2 Kings 3:27 that Mesha, in a critical situation of battle, offered his son on the wall of his city, the consequence of which was that the wrath of Chemosh began to destroy Israel instantly. I think that's a bit of an overstatement. Nowhere else is the mighty activity of a foreign god conceded in such an unrestrained manner. Okay, so he generally agrees with what Dan's saying. Seventh is Francesca Stravakopoulou, and this book is King Manasseh and Child Sacrifice, Biblical Distortions of Historical Realities. He is far less certain that it is clear compared to McClellan. He says, this is pages 176 to 77. The implication, therefore, is that Chemosh, the Moabite god, has defeated the combined military forces of Israel, Judah, and Edom, and their respective deities too. And then a footnote which says, it is important to note that here the divine recipient of the sacrifice is not named, nor indeed is the source of the wrath indicated. Various ancient and modern suggestions of the latter include Chemosh, Adonai, Israel, Moab, and the Edomite king. See the commentaries for further discussions. And then he goes on out of the footnote here, but this implication remains just that, for as Burns comments, the Hebrew Bible is, quote, notoriously evasive when it comes to acknowledging the power of foreign gods, end quote. Far more careful, far more restrained. You can see that tone there. Eighth footnote, Raymond Westbrook, Elijah's True Prophecy in 2 Kings 3's Journal of Biblical Literature article actually says nothing about the Great Wrath. The ninth source, book by Smith, God in Translation, I don't have access to it, so this is the one that I couldn't find out about. And then the 10th, Tom Stark, The Human Faces of God, What Scripture Reveals When It Gets God Wrong and Why Inerrancy Tries to Hide It. The 2011 book, he does argue for Chemosh's wrath. He does interact with a couple of the other views. Interestingly, doesn't cite them at all, but he does come out in favor of the same position that Dan takes. So of these 10 sources, I have access to 9, and of these 9, 2 do not even relevantly touch on the topic. 1 argues directly against the conclusion. Only 4 land clearly where McClellan does, and 2 acknowledge this as a reading that is possible, but they really lean into the ambiguity of it. And even the ones that land where McClellan do tend to acknowledge that there are some other perspectives. So there's my sources, there's the scholarship that just reinforces my point that did you know this is quite an oversimplification, and that most of the scholars here at best acknowledge that this is not incredibly straightforward. So there's my sources, should have cited them. Here's what's interesting. I'll be actually curious to look at the statistics here to see how many viewers dropped off as I was reading and I was going through those sources, because the actual work of scholarship can be pretty boring, pretty laborious if you're not really into it. And I think that gets to some of the genre differences here between video and books. But anyways, there you go. Point number 7, he says, or she says, good luck with the rest of your grad school. I appreciate that comment. Thanks for the respect. Thanks for the acknowledgement that there is another human being on the other side of your comments. And I'm sure that if we met in person, we'd get along great. And by the way, I think that's true of Dan. I think we would probably get along great. And just a little reminder here that it's good to debate ideas, but to make sure that we respect the people behind those ideas is important, something that I strive to do. Sure, haven't always done it perfectly, but a great reminder. And so thank you to Virtual Frog 2000 for doing a good job of that. Now, a couple of other points. Many of the comments pointed to scholarly consensus. And they acknowledged, Dan's not doing scholarship. He's not claiming to do scholarship. What he's doing is representing the scholarly consensus. He's reporting on the scholarly consensus on these different points. Now, scholarly consensus is one of those topics that, or one of those phrases that sounds pretty significant to those who are not directly working with scholarship themselves, but it's one that some scholars themselves recognize is just not a very helpful category. Just some of my own thoughts. Scholarly consensus sometimes doesn't exist. There just isn't a consensus. Second, it can be hard to verify that consensus does exist if you're not a scholar. So just saying, well, this is the consensus is a way that a scholar essentially is pulling rank, but they're making the issues inaccessible to those who don't actually have access to scholarship or to the tools of scholarship and can kind of find out for themselves, can investigate for themselves. Third, interestingly, just one of the important goals of scholarship is not to maintain consensus. It's not like that's what's going on here. There's consensus and a bunch of guys are sitting around guarding it from naysayers. One of the main jobs of a scholar is to challenge consensus. And so here's a quote from Joel S. Baden from Yale Divinity School in an article that I'm going to link to here. He says this about the whole concept of scholarly consensus. We trade not in facts, not in certainties, but in ideas, in possibilities. Rare indeed is the argument that can be fully discounted or completely accepted. Consensus obscures this fundamental truth about what it is that we do. No claim, positive or negative, is ever so certain as to no longer require argumentation. We may never stop using the word consensus or the notions underwriting it, but at the very least we can recognize that it has a deleterious effect on the way our students learn how to think, how to argue effectively, how to engage with other scholars, how to contribute to the intellectual discourse of the field. And this, I think we can all agree, is something we should be wary of. So even if all that Dan's doing is reporting on the scholarly consensus, he's still holding the actual work of scholarship, if that's the case, at a bit of arm's length from his listeners or his watchers. And I go back to my point that I made in the previous video, is that someone who really is digging into these things and wants to know for themselves, who's really thinking critically, they're not going to be satisfied by that idea of scholarly consensus. They're going to want to know for themselves. They're going to want to know what are the issues and where is that consensus being challenged and so on. Which brings me back to this idea of just devotionals for skeptics, that if all that's happening is repeating and reporting on scholarly consensus, that's going to satisfy some people who might be inclined to agree, but I'm not sure how much that's going to satisfy those who are really interacting at a critical level and are really asking the big questions. Take that for what you will. So let me make a final comment as I wrap things up here. This channel is about belief and faith and doubt and skepticism and deconstruction and so on. And so just like Dan's channel is about something and trying to do something, so is mine. And I have that channel introduction that explains that. So I am interested in the way that Dan's videos appeal to people who are struggling with doubt, struggling with faith. And so my first video and this video about Dan are not just general comments on him in general. I am zooming in and interested in this area that's germane to the topic of my channel. And it has to be said, and I want to acknowledge that Dan does a fair bit of interacting with Christian apologists. And it does have to be said, and I'll be happy to say it, that a lot of the time he seems to do a better job of dealing with the facts than they do. And I have no problem saying that. There's a part of the problem, though, is that I seem to get the idea, it's not a scholarly opinion here, I'm just stating my own experience here, that it seems like some people think that material representing confessional belief falls into the category of apologetics. And the reality is that evangelical scholarship, confessional scholarship, is so much bigger than apologetics. And some of the guys on YouTube, even the big heavy hitters, guys like Wes Huff and Glenn Scrivener, great guys doing what they do, those are not our scholars. Those are not the evangelical scholars that we're looking up and researching as we're doing seminary studies or writing sermons or writing research papers or anything. And so there's again, this issue of the YouTubeification of some of these conversations and the struggle that comes there. And so I just want to say to those who are watching this video and watching this channel because you're interested in these issues of faith and doubt and skepticism and so on, that just because Dan can Hulk smash a bunch of internet YouTuber apologists does not mean that he has Hulk smashed confessional scholarship or evangelical belief. It just means that these apologists weren't doing a super great job. I think that we have to ask some big questions about how apologetics works and how apologetics happens. But for years, it's just been my understanding that if I want really good answers to some of these questions that people ask and wonder about, I don't go to apologists. I go to good scholarly material. And if I want to know, how do evangelicals wrestle with, for example, the issue of the timing of the Last Supper? What did it happen as a Passover or not? Does John disagree with the synoptics? Just to give an example. I don't go to an apologist. I go to something like D.A. Carson's Pillar Commentary on John to see, how does an evangelical scholar who's wrestling with the text of Scripture wrestle with this issue, and what are the conclusions that he comes to? And so I would love to see Dan do more interaction with not just YouTubers on the internet, because I think he's going to continue to do what he does and show them up, and that's great. But in some ways, it might be a little bit like a high schooler going back to elementary school to pick fights with the bullies. Yeah, he's going to win, but what about going to a place where people are more equally matched in size and so on? I would love to see Dan do more interaction with actual published scholarship about some of these positions that he's disagreeing with. He wants to take on the Trinity. Don't go after a video that Glenn Scrivener did. Go after some of the thousands of published books on the Trinity. Pick one of them and interact with it. And hopefully we'll see more of that in the future. That's all for now, because we should be reading, so see you later.